Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are going, well, not just into a complex topic, but right into the absolute private epicenter of human experience. We're talking about the voice in your head. You know,
Mm.
the one that silent, relentless stream of commentary, the memory rehearsals, the planning, and sometimes that deep, unrelenting criticism.
It's the ultimate constant companion, isn't it?
Hmm.
But that's where we find this fundamental paradox we're going to explore.
A paradox.
Yeah, this internal verbal experience, what we call inner speech. It's the most intimate thing you have, but it so rarely feels like it's actually you.
Right. It feels separate.
It does. Why does it so often show up as this, strict commander or an unyielding critic or even a sarcastic narrator whose contract you definitely never signed? It feels alien.
That feeling of separation is really the core mystery, isn't it? Hearing a voice that dictates or judges, but doesn't feel entirely self-generated.
And it has this profound history. So
Yeah.
we're really embarking on a journey today to understand this mental architect.
Okay, so where are we going?
We're going to move from some pretty radical historical theories, ideas that suggest conscious introspection is a relatively new human invention,
Wow, okay.
all the way through to cutting-edge neuroscience that explains how your brain actually creates that voice, and then finally to practical cognitive psychology.
And our mission for this deep dive is, I think, really tailored for you, the listener.
Absolutely. We're going to explain the science behind inner speech, tracing it all the way from childhood chatter to adult silence.
We'll also get into the critical functions it performs for memory, for planning, and probably most importantly.
We're going to equip you with the knowledge to understand why that voice turns negative and how to consciously take control.
So turning that internal saboteur into a constructive ally.
Exactly. The narrative we're chasing today is that the voice feels detached because, well, neurologically and developmentally, it is an internalized, high-speed copy of external conversation.
And understanding that distance is the key to mastering it.
That's the key.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I think we should start with a sort of thought experiment. One that suggests the very structure of the human mind has fundamentally changed over the last 3,000 years or so.
It's a huge idea. We start with this radical theory that self-reflective consciousness, that state of introspection, the sense of an internal I making deliberate choices.
The thing we think of as being fundamentally human.
Exactly. That it's a relatively recent cultural and neurological invention, maybe emerging only 3,000 years ago, around the turbulent end of the Bronze Age.
And this is the foundation of the bicameral mentality hypothesis, right?
That's it, famously detailed by Julian Jaynes. He argued that before this shift, early modern humans, they just weren't introspective in the way we are today. They operated with a two-chamber mind.
Bicameral, 2 rooms.
Literally,
Yeah.
a state of mind that lacked our sophisticated capacity for, metacognition, for thinking.
Yeah. Okay, I want to clarify what that actually means for a listener. If they couldn't introspect or self-reflect, how on earth did they navigate new situations? How did they make plans or manage the crises of daily life? Where did their direction come from?
Well, they didn't deliberate internally, not in the complex comparative way we do. Jaynes hypothesized that when they were faced with a situation that required volition or creativity or some crucial response,
A moment of stress.
a moment of stress or
Or
necessity, yeah, they experienced the required behavior as an instruction. And that instruction was delivered as an auditory verbal hallucination.
wait, a hallucination?
Yes, the action they needed to take felt completely external.
So the control mechanism was linguistic, it was words, but they perceived the source as coming from outside of themselves.
That's the core of the theory.
So they would literally hear a voice telling them precisely what to do, like, go left, or build the wall taller, or attack now.
That's the idea. It was a linguistic control system, supposedly operating in the brain's right hemisphere, the command chamber, communicating these necessary instructions to the person's operational chamber, which just obeyed.
Without question.
Without question. They didn't see this as a personal decision-making process.
Yeah.
They attributed these very distinct commands or this authoritative advice to external, non-human entities.
My gods.
The gods or demons or muses. The key point is that the individual was completely unaware of their own internal thought processes as a source of self-direction. They just didn't have the internal lexicon to describe an ego or a deciding self.
That is a staggering claim. It means that the concept of free will or personal choice, as we understand it, that internal agony of choosing between two options, Was neurologically unavailable to them.
Exactly. Without that mechanism for self-reflection, they just lack the foundation for what we call autobiographical memory, the memory tied to personal decision-making. And they lack the executive ego functions for deliberate self-control.
So what was their memory like?
It was likely episodic, just tied to what they did, not why they decided to do it.
No, James didn't just pull this out of thin air. He grounded this theory in anthropology and history. Where do we see this shift in the actual textual evidence?
Right. He built his case largely on analyzing foundational texts. He argued that the psychological vocabulary changes profoundly between eras.
How so?
If you meticulously analyze early texts, like Homer's Iliad, which is all about the siege of Troy, you find this really striking absence of terminology for concepts like mind or soul or internal deliberation.
So the characters don't reflect.
They don't. They're moved by forces.
Can you give us a concrete example of that?
Sure. Think about that famous scene in the Iliad. Achilles is enraged. He's about to draw his sword and attack Agamemnon, his superior.
Okay.
He doesn't go through an internal debate like, should I kill him? What are the consequences? I should probably restrain myself. None of that happens.
So what does happen?
The text says the goddess Athena, who is invisible to everyone else, appears, grabs Achilles by his hair, and physically restrains him. She tells him verbally, refrain from action.
And he just obeys.
He just obeys. The motivation for restraint is entirely external and auditory.
Now contrast that with the Odyssey, which most scholars think is a slightly later text.
The Odyssey shows the beginnings of that shift. Its hero Odysseus, he's famous not for following divine commands, but for his cunning, his planning, his internal deception.
Right. He's always scheming.
He is. He actively struggles with complex problems, he relies on his memory, and he chooses difficult paths. These are all indications of a mind that's beginning to synthesize and deliberate internally. It's laying the groundwork for our modern concept of an individual consciousness that can be held accountable for its choices.
And James also connected this bicameral structure to how ancient societies were organized.
He did. The bicameral mentality likely made it easier to organize these early, large-scale stationary communities. I mean, if everyone automatically obeyed their specific guiding voices, their gods, then social conformity, big coordinated efforts.
Like building pyramids or complex irrigation systems.
Exactly. All of that becomes inherently easier to maintain. And the prevalence of so many anthropomorphic gods, one for every aspect of life, is seen as a reflection of each bicameral person having a personalized voice that mirrored their immediate needs.
The connection to the dead is particularly unsettling, though, the idea that corpses were still speaking.
It's unsettling to us, but it speaks to the perceived reality of these voices for them. James pointed to the historical practice of ancestor worship, where the dead were often treated as if they were still present and operational.
They were seated at the table, dressed, even fed offerings.
Yes. And he theorized this came from the belief that the deceased were literally the source of continuing auditory commands for the community. The voice of the patriarch was an actual, continuing auditory phenomenon.
So we have to face the biggest question, and I know it's one of the main critiques of the theory. How and why did this supposedly universal mental system just break down? What caused this massive shift to consciousness?
The hypothesis pinpoints the breakdown to a period of, radical and profound upheaval. The late second millennium BCE, what's often called the Late Bronze Age collapse.
An era of widespread societal destruction, mass migration, climate crises.
Total chaos. The collapse of established empires and trade routes. This led to vastly increased societal complexity and constant, unexpected, acute stress.
So a crisis that required adaptability, which the obey the voice mechanism just couldn't handle.
Exactly. The automatic response system, the bicameral instruction set, was too inflexible. Survival suddenly required individual adaptability, creativity, the ability to synthesize novel solutions on the fly.
Capabilities that all rely on an internal, self-aware decision maker.
Right. To survive, the human mind was forced to invent a new mechanism. Consciousness, built on metaphorical language.
And we see evidence of this shift in the new religious and cultural practices that pop up right after this period.
We do. Practices like divination, consulting oracles, all these ritualized, conscious forms of prayer, they all arose during this transitional era. James saw these as frantic cultural attempts to consciously summon instructions from the gods whose voices could no longer be reliably heard.
So people were trying to get back to that old system.
They were trying to reestablish the mental control mechanism that society had always relied on.
So what are the modern echoes of this ancient mind structure? How does this historical context relate to our contemporary understanding of the voice?
Well, the theory suggests that conditions today that involve command hallucinations, particularly in cases of schizophrenia, are vestiges of this older state, a kind of neurological glitch.
Remnants of the ancient mental mechanism.
Exactly. If the mind structure was bicameral, then an auditory command was normal. Today, in a conscious mind, that same auditory command system is considered a malfunction, a misattribution of self-generated speech to an external source.
So whether you buy the whole bicameral theory or not, it serves as this powerful thought experiment. It shows how fundamentally linguistic and cultural our internal reality is, and how easily our minds can perceive an internal command as an external authority.
It's a powerful setup for understanding our own modern internal critic. And that radical historical perspective, this idea that internal commands actually start externally, it provides the perfect bridge to modern developmental psychology.
Right.
Because contemporary science confirms that our adult internal voice, our inner speech, it really does originate externally in the form of childhood talk.
Okay, so let's transition to defining inner speech, because it's not just generalized thinking, is it? It's a very specific linguistic process.
It is. Inner speech is language that we experience internally without any overt audible articulation. It's what you might call covert self-talk.
And the most influential model for how this develops comes from the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky.
That's right. Vygotsky established a really clear developmental trajectory for this internal linguistic tool.
So what's step one? Where does it begin?
Step one, the essential first step, is what he called private speech.
Private speech.
This is the external, audible self-talk that young children use to guide their actions. You see toddlers doing this constantly.
Oh, yeah. No, the car goes up the ramp faster now. Don't spill the juice.
Exactly that. They're narrating.
So the child is basically outsourcing their developing executive function to their own mouth. They're verbalizing the rules and instructions for the task they're doing.
Precisely. This overt, self-directed language is essential because it lets the child externalize their cognitive regulation. They're using their own voice as a tool to maintain focus, to plan a sequence of actions, or to control an impulse.
And studies show this works, right?
Oh yeah, studies show that children who use more private speech tend to be better at challenging tasks because that verbal output helps them structure the problem.
And then as they get older, that talking moves intrapsychologically. It moves indoors.
Correct. The transition starts around the late preschool and early school years. As children mature and get more adept at social language, this self-directed external speech moves inward and becomes internalized.
And this isn't just turning down the volume.
No, crucially it isn't. The internalization process actually transforms the structure of the language. It becomes structurally different, much faster, more condensed, and syntactically incomplete.
I think we all recognize that difference intuitively. When I'm talking out loud, I'm using full sentences, but when I'm thinking internally, it's often just fragments or quick mental associations.
And that transformation results in the flexible, efficient covert system we use as adults. We tend to distinguish between two primary forms of adult inner speech.
Okay.
The first is expanded inner speech. This is the one that retains the rhythmic and syntactic structure of external dialogue. You use this when you're, say, rehearsing a complex conversation or writing a mental email.
Full, properly formed sentences.
Exactly. But the second form, which is what you mentioned, is the default. That's condensed inner speech.
And this is the shorthand version.
It's highly abbreviated, fragmentary. It's rapid-fire thinking in pure meanings. Vygotsky called this language where the predicate dominates and the subject is dropped, because the subject is always I or whatever you're focused on.
So his cognitive shortcut, if you need milk, your inner thought isn't, I need to remember to buy milk when I go to the store later. It's just
Milk. Store.
right. So the mind defaults to this condensed version for efficiency. It cuts out all the conversational overhead. When do we switch back to the full expanded version?
The switch is usually triggered by stress or a high cognitive challenge, or when a task demands really careful articulation, like preparing to deliver a complicated instruction or trying to override a strong emotional reaction.
So the expanded structured form helps us slow down and impose some logical order.
It does. It lets us rehearse the phonological properties we need for clear communication or thought.
You also mentioned that inner speech is often dialogic, that back and forth internal argument we have with ourselves all the time.
This dialogic quality is foundational. Inner speech is rarely a monolithic monologue. It's almost always a conversational process with a back and forth exchange.
And this isn't just random chatter.
No, it's a direct rehearsal of social interaction. We are internalizing the communicative patterns we learned externally.
And that links back powerfully to understanding other people, right?
Absolutely. The dialogic nature of our inner speech is strongly linked to the development of social cognition, specifically what's called theory of mind.
The ability to understand that others have beliefs, desires, and perspectives different from our own.
Exactly. By staging these internal debates, okay, if I say X, she'll probably think Y, so then I should plan to respond with Z. We're practicing, we're predicting social outcomes and honing our empathetic and strategic communication skills
So the richness of your internal conversation directly feeds the nuance of your external social life.
directly. And it's important to remember that inner speech isn't just some passive narrator. It's an active, essential cognitive toolkit that facilitates really complex adult functioning.
Okay, so let's detail those functional roles, starting with working memory, because this is where inner speech really acts as the brain's engine.
It's the cornerstone of the phonological loop, which is a critical subsystem within our working memory.
And working memory is our mental workspace, right? The
Mm,
ability to hold and manipulate information online for immediate tasks.
that's it. And the phonological loop allows us to retain and rehearse verbal information actively.
The classic example being trying to remember a new phone number long enough to dial it. You're just repeating it to yourself internally over and over.
Exactly. You are literally using inner speech to keep that verbal information fresh, cycling it through the loop. And the capacity of this loop is highly limited, usually to about 7 items. And without the internal voice rehearsing those sounds, the memory just decays rapidly.
And we can prove this connection empirically, can't we?
We can, using a method called articulatory suppression. It's a dual-task procedure. A participant is given a memory task, say, recalling a list of digits, while simultaneously being forced to repeat a non-word sound out loud, like the, over and over again.
And repeating the ties up the vocal apparatus, and more importantly, it ties up that internal rehearsal system.
It occupies the exact articulation mechanism that inner speech relies on. And the research consistently shows that blocking inner speech this way, specifically and dramatically, impairs tasks that rely on verbal rehearsal.
Like recalling digit sequences or word lists.
Right. But, crucially, it typically does not interfere with nonverbal tasks, like remembering visual patterns or spatial locations.
Which is pretty robust evidence that inner speech is the dedicated engine for verbal short-term memory.
It is.
Now, moving beyond memory, inner speech is also at play when we read, this act of subvocalization.
Subvocalization, yeah. It's the internal pronouncement of written words. While expert readers can suppress it to read faster, many people engage in it, especially with difficult or technical texts. And this internal process closely mimics external speech.
What do you mean by that? How so?
Well, studies have shown that our internal voice during reading isn't some generic robotic voice. It's highly personalized. It's influenced by our experiences.
So if I listen to a difficult piece of writing being read aloud by someone with a distinctive accent,
And then you silently read that same text later, your internal reading voice will often adopt characteristics of that speaker's accent or even their specific pace and inflection.
oh.
Yeah. Inner speech is actively synthesizing perceived linguistic features to help with comprehension, especially when the reading is challenging.
Okay, so let's get into the neural mechanism. If we're producing silent language, does the brain activate the same areas as if we were speaking out loud?
For the most part, yes. Large parts of the brain network are shared. Inner speech heavily recruits the classic frontotemporal language networks used for producing and perceiving overt speech.
So we're talking about Broca's area and Wernicke's area?
Exactly. We see activation in the left inferior frontal gyrus Broca's area for speech production, and in the posterior superior temporal gyrus Wernicke's area for language perception. Neuroimaging studies confirm that covert speech involves recruiting both of these regions, essentially engaging a motor plan for speaking, but then suppressing the actual movement.
But that brings us right back to the paradox. If the brain areas for both production and perception are active, why don't we hear our internal voice as an external sound? How does the brain know its own thoughts aren't someone whispering in the room?
This is a critical question, and the answer, we think, lies in what's called the forward model. It's a fundamental neurological mechanism the brain uses to monitor its own actions.
Okay.
The brain constantly needs to predict the sensory consequences of any motor action it's about to initiate.
So when I decide to move my arm, my brain sends a signal to move the arm, but it simultaneously sends a prediction signal to the sensory parts of my brain saying, hey, expect to feel this movement, don't be surprised.
Precisely. And that simultaneous prediction signal is known as an efference copy.
An efference copy.
Right. So when we engage in inner speech, which is really just an aborted motor plan for speaking, an efference copy is sent to the auditory sensory areas.
So, if my brain is about to produce the sound of the word coffee internally, the efference copy tells my auditory cortex, "Alert! We are generating the sound of coffee internally. Do not process this sound as coming from the outside world."
That's a perfect way to put it. The efference copy inhibits the sensory areas. It effectively cancels out the internal sound, or at least attenuates the perception.
And this inhibition is what maintains the sense that the verbal output is self-generated.
Yes, the normal experience of inner speech is likely the perception of this predicted sensory outcome, that silent sound that's just familiar enough to recognize as our own, but muted enough not to be mistaken for reality.
And this forward model has to be the key to understanding auditory verbal hallucinations.
Absolutely. A breakdown in this forward model mechanism is critical for the misattribution theory of hallucinations, especially in conditions like schizophrenia.
So what's happening there?
Well, in these cases, the internal voice is generated, but the efference copy either isn't sent correctly or the auditory cortex isn't properly inhibited. So the self-generated inner speech reaches the sensory system without the self-generated tag.
Meaning the person perceives their own thought as an alien external command. The thought is theirs, but the source feels totally foreign.
Exactly. This mismatch causes the person to misattribute their self-generated inner speech to an external source. Hence, the sensation of hearing voices that feel alien and are often commanding or instructing them.
The paradoxical feeling of the voice being alien yet self.
It's explained by the fact that the production network generated the content, but the monitoring system failed to attribute it correctly.
The neural machinery is clearly complex, but the phenomenology, what it actually feels like to have this voice, is arguably even more surprising. For something that we think of as universal, the internal experience is incredibly varied.
It really is.
So why do we often feel our inner voice sounds so unfamiliar?
Well, first, we have to confront a massive misconception. Not everyone even has that continuous verbal monologue we've been talking about.
Wait, really?
Yes. Phenomenological research suggests a substantial number of people report having no continuous verbal inner monologue at all.
That is genuinely hard for me as a constant internal talker to even grasp. If they don't have a narrator, how do they process complex thoughts or plan their day? How do they think?
Their cognition relies on nonverbal processes. They often describe their thinking as instantaneous, a nonlinear knowledge transfer, where the realization or the solution just arrives fully formed without needing any verbal scaffolding.
So they might use vivid visual imagery or spatial reasoning.
Exactly, or thinking in abstract conceptual maps. When planning a complex trip, for instance, they don't rehearse the steps verbally. They might just instantly visualize the route, the time allocations, the contingencies, all laid out like a physical map in their mind.
It sounds like thinking in pure meaning rather than in the restrictive, linear format of language.
That's precisely it. They experience the meaning or the solution without the linguistic articulation. When they read, they see the word and just know the meaning. They don't subvocalize.
And that just shatters the assumption that constant verbal narration is required for high-level cognition.
It does. It highlights the incredible diversity of human internal experience.
Okay, but for the majority of us who do have inner speech, why does it rarely sound like our own recorded external voice? People report it being younger or faster or having this sort of neutral, even ethereal tone.
There are a couple of powerful reasons for that. One is physiological and one is psychological.
Okay.
The physiological reason is simple: bone conduction. When you speak aloud, you hear the sound traveling through the air and the vibrations conducted through the bones in your skull, which heavily emphasizes lower frequencies.
Which is why your recorded voice always sounds higher pitched and weird to you. It lacks that bone-conducted resonance.
Right. So the internal voice, which lacks both air and bone conduction, might be closer to your real voice, stripped of all that bodily interference.
Or maybe an idealized version.
That's the psychological part. It could be an idealized, purified version. The voice often reflects a subconscious self-perception. For example, your internal voice might adopt the tone of someone who has strongly influenced your life: a mentor, a parent, or even a fictional character whose wisdom you admire.
So it serves as an internal filter, representing the tone you believe you should use to advise yourself.
Exactly. And this brings us to why that internal debate feels so real, this idea that our mind is inherently plural and hosts an internal cast of characters.
An inner team.
The self is fundamentally functional, not singular. We possess these multiple functional aspects which we can conceptualize as an inner team. These aren't multiple personalities, just distinct psychological roles that emerge dynamically depending on the situation.
So let's name some of the common members of this team.
The roster is varied, but you'll often find the critic, who's focused on past failures and potential threats, the planner, who is all about structure, logic, and future steps,
And the worrier.
and the worrier, who focuses on potential negative outcomes. But then you also have the advocate or friend, the compassionate voice, and often the inner child, the source of immediate, often impulsive desires.
So when you feel like you're genuinely arguing with yourself, it's not confusion, it's an internal team meeting where two of these aspects are vying for control.
Precisely. The internal chaos is often the result of this spontaneous, unconscious deliberation. The planner and the worrier are debating strategy, but then the critic jumps in and yells, "It doesn't matter what you plan, you'll fail anyway."
And the intensity of that debate reflects the conflict between our fundamental psychological needs like safety versus growth.
It does. And we can see what happens when the dialogic nature of this inner team is compromised in certain populations.
Which is where the research on autism spectrum disorder comes in.
It's fascinating. Studies suggest that high-functioning adults with ASD can successfully use monologic inner speech, the rehearsal for memory and procedural tasks. But they sometimes show difficulty deploying the more socially rooted dialogic inner speech.
The kind you need for complex social planning, emotional regulation, and generating multiple perspectives on a problem.
Yes, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Hmm.
If the dialogic structure is rooted in social interaction, then a difficulty with external communication would naturally be mirrored by a less rich or less flexible internal conversation tool.
It really emphasizes that the internal voice isn't some purely biological constant. It's a learned, internalized social technology.
It is. The richer and more nuanced your external communication and relationships are, the more complex and useful your internal advisory team becomes.
We've established that the internal voice is this miraculous cognitive tool, but for so many listeners, I think its primary characteristic is its negativity. It becomes detrimental when it spirals into chatter or rumination. This is when the internal voice stops being an advisor and becomes a genuine saboteur.
And rumination is defined as the repetitive and passive focus on distress and negative verbal thoughts. This is that spiral of, "I will never succeed," or "I should have done X differently. Everyone is judging me."
It's a loop.
It's a loop. And this cyclical, repetitive, negative self-talk is strongly correlated with chronic stress, anxiety, and the onset of depression because it keeps the emotional wound perpetually open.
The great news, though, is that since this voice is an internalized mechanism, we can consciously learn to edit and control it.
We can.
The goal is to move from self-sabotage to a more constructive, mentoring relationship with ourselves.
That's right. And the fundamental strategy behind all the management techniques is creating psychological distance from the negative emotion and the thought that comes with it.
So when you're ruminating, the thought is your identity. I am a failure.
Yes. Distancing techniques separate the you who is listening from the voice that is speaking.
Okay, let's start with the most direct language technique. How do we build distance just using grammar?
This involves altering the person you use in your self-talk. It's called distant self-talk. So when you're facing a difficult situation, instead of accepting that internal identity statement, "I am completely overwhelmed" or "I am failing," you consciously shift the language to the second or third person.
So give us a specific script a listener can try.
When you feel that panic rising, instead of thinking, "I can't believe I messed that up," try addressing yourself directly by your own name or just as you, for example.
Okay.
Okay, your name, you're feeling immense pressure right now. What is the single most important task you need to complete first?
And that subtle linguistic shift turns an overwhelming identity statement, "I am panic," into a rational instruction.
It forces your mind into a coaching role rather than a victim role. It's surprisingly powerful.
That is powerful. What about expanding our perspective using other psychological techniques?
A highly effective one is consulting a friend. We are notoriously much harsher on ourselves than we would ever be on our loved ones.
That's true.
So when the critic is activated, just stop and ask yourself, what advice would I give my most respected friend if they were in this exact situation? Immediately, your internal voice softens, becomes more logical, and offers compassion because it's operating under the social rule of support.
The critic is silenced, and the internal friend takes the floor. What about using time as a distancing mechanism?
That's the strategy of time travel. Rumination traps us in the immediacy of a crisis. So to break that, you imagine the problem from a temporal distance.
So you ask yourself, how important will this particular stressor seem to me when I look back at it in a month or a year
Oh,
or 5 years?
exactly. And it's so effective for minimizing the immediate emotional size of the problem. Very few of our catastrophic stresses retain their perceived magnitude when you view them from the perspective of a year from now.
It's a cognitive reality check.
It is. It places the immediate crisis into a much larger life narrative. You realize the feeling is temporary and that you've survived equally acute stresses before.
Many of these strategies are about externalizing the internal pressure cooker of thoughts. Writing them down is a physical way to do that.
Externalization through writing is a crucial technique. When negative thoughts are chaotic and spiraling, the hallmark of chatter, they feel overwhelming because they have no structure.
So you just write them down.
Simply writing down the negative thoughts unfiltered, without worrying about grammar or coherence, helps tremendously. It turns a chaotic, overwhelming internal process into a structured, visible, and physically separate object.
So once the thoughts are on paper, they're no longer purely you.
They're not. They're words you can analyze, you can cross them out, you can challenge them. The process externalizes the rumination, and it allows the logical part of your brain, the frontal cortex, to take over from the emotional brain.
Finally, what about simple behavioral or environmental strategies that can restore a sense of mastery?
Since rumination often thrives when we feel loss of control, engaging in organizational or physical rituals can counter that feeling. Simple acts, cleaning your desk, tidying your living space, following a meticulous morning routine.
They restore a sense of mastery that the internal chaos erodes.
Right, you are actively demonstrating to yourself that you possess the executive function to structure your immediate environment, which helps stabilize your internal state.
And what about changing the external focus entirely?
Consciously seeking out the experience of awe.
Ah,
Yes, by spending time observing a vast landscape, standing under a massive night sky, or watching the power of the ocean. The experience of awe is linked to a perceived reduction in the size of the self. And when the self feels small in the context of the universe.
the internal problems and the self-focused chatter that surrounds them also shrink.
Exactly. It reduces the mental burden and provides essential perspective.
This deep dive has spanned millennia, from the audible voices of ancient gods all the way to the silent syntax of our inner life.
It's been quite a journey.
And we've established that the voice in your head is this fascinating mix of evolutionary necessity, Vygotskian cognitive machinery, and absorbed social influence. It's a personal orchestra, really,
Yeah.
built from every external command and expectation you've ever internalized.
Mm-hmm.
So that feeling of detachment, the sense that the voice is slightly unfamiliar, that's completely normal. It's the echo of those external filters being processed internally over time.
And that recognition gives you tremendous power. I think the key insight is realizing that while you can't stop thoughts from appearing automatically, you are definitively the team leader of your internal cast.
You have the authority to assign roles and manage the tone.
You do. That critical voice is rarely speaking the truth. It's usually signaling an old inherited belief or a fear that you absorbed a long, long time ago.
So you don't have to banish the critic, but you can change its job description.
Precisely. You shift it from being a saboteur to being a risk averter. When you apply these distancing techniques and consciously notice that harsh, critical tone, you loosen its automatic grip. And then you can choose to strengthen the voice that feels steady and gentle and true, the inner advocate.
This is the difference between being subjected to your thoughts and becoming the conscious editor of your inner narrative.
That's it. So here's a final provocative thought for you to carry forward as you listen to your own internal architecture. If our deepest internal experience is so profoundly shaped by the linguistic models we internalize, the tone of our parents, the authority of a teacher, the wisdom of some cultural figure, imagine the profound potential of deliberately choosing the internal voice of the wisest, most compassionate mentor you can imagine. What would happen if for just a week you mandated that that specific benevolent persona deliver your self-talk, your planning, and your instructions? How significantly would shifting the sound and authority of your inner world change the quality of your decisions and your fundamental sense of self-worth? The tools are linguistic. The change is personal.